Hello everyone, welcome back to the channel Airbus What's It Doing Now? And I know what you're thinking, 2 videos in almost as many days. I know what is going on. Well, I'll tell you what's going on. I'm not flying as much at the moment because I'm been on leave and I'm starting to feel slightly human again, should I say. So what are we going to take a look at today? So this is part of the safety corner part of the channel, and today we're going to have a look at a recent safety article which came out from Airbus about evacuation, and it's entitled "Attention Crew at Stations." It goes on from a briefing which you did recently about the rejected takeoff, so this will kind of nicely follow on if you've just completed that episode. And it's a really nice article here, just kind of focusing on some of the crew communication, which is absolutely vital when we're dealing with a very high stressful, very high workload situation such as an evacuation. Some nice top tips in this article as well to help ensure a safe and efficient outcome and evacuation. The study goes on, or the briefing goes into 2 case studies, both of which actually involved the cabin crew initiating the evacuation. I think one of them was when the aircraft was taxiing, where the cabin crew detected smoke, and the other case study involves an RTO with a contained damaged engine. But as I say, in both cases, the cabin crew initiated the evacuation, which of course they can do if the situation is, dire and life-threatening. And you can look at the terminology in your operations manual and in the crew procedures manual for what when a cabin crew can actually initiate the evacuation. But in both cases here, the cabin crew initiated the evacuation and the pilots weren't necessarily aware until too late that was happening. So we focus a lot of attention here in communication. It talks about being best prepared for an evacuation from aircraft knowledge, not just from the pilot's perspective, but also from the cabin crew's perspective in terms of knowledge of their aircraft type and the emergency equipment. Now, in our airline, we don't really suffer too much from variance 19, 20, 21. Of course, the location of the equipment is slightly different, but we're not operating mixed fleet. But some of you it will be, so that's quite an important thing to remember. You won't necessarily be operating as different aircraft fleet, but of course your cabin crew may very well be, and that's an important message here. It also talks about the importance of an effective crew briefing, both with the cabin crew, so wherever you do that, get my teeth in, wherever you do that, be it on the aircraft or in a designated crew area, whether that be in a crew room or in the terminal somewhere, wherever that might be for you and your airline. But the importance of the effective briefing, both with the cabin crew and the pilots. And we take a little look here in what's called the review, as Airbus put it, as I know it, as the 30-second review for the cabin crew, and passenger identification, able bodily persons, ABPs, incredibly important during evacuation in there. But your booking matrix might actually do a lot of that work for you. But there's a little piece of the article where we go into it. Company SOPs, guys. Now, I've got this in the beginning of every episode that I do. It's a bit of a clause in there to remember that your SOPs are paramount and foremost for anything else that I say here. So you need to obviously follow that, and that a lot of your SOPs will dictate how this goes, but much of it will be written by Airbus, and then your SOP will be overlaid on top of that as to how your airline wants to handle this. So do bear this in mind. But company SOPs will dictate the flow of actions together with Airbus recommendations, and there are some nice helpful aid memoirs in how this article actually structures this, which is quite nice, such as stop, inform, ECAM, assess, and then we run through the process, followed by decide, secure, initiate, and then we look the order from the flight deck and the cabin crew, and then we look at an evacuation itself. We run all the way through, including that might be initiated by the cabin crew from the FAP, and what that's likely to look like. Okay, so let's get a look at the report itself. Now, with all these, what I tend to do is I tend to read it and then put my kind of add some value to it, or if I can, in my own experience and my interpretation of it. Okay, so just a reminder, these are all available for you to read at your leisure at no cost and are freely available to anybody. So just look up Airbus safety first. And one thing I've realized, I've lied to you already, because this isn't a recent article. It's recent for me because I've read it, but it's actually in December 2020. So if you're looking for a recent article, it's not. You've got to scroll down a little bit, but recent in as much as it's something we've spoken about recently. So an emergency evacuation is always stressful, or a stressful situation for passengers, cabin crews and flight crews. You'll remember the last time you did an RTO in the sim, you know you're in a simulator, but it gets very stressful, doesn't it, knowing that you might have to evacuate. Now, one thing I will try and remind you about is that a rejected takeoff shouldn't always be intrinsically linked, and I've covered this in another safety episode, with an evacuation. It doesn't always have to end like this. So I've got to be a little bit careful here in not leading you down the primrose path, in that it will always be an evacuation. We're dealing with evacuation here purely as an exercise to look at some of the safety areas and focus on it, okay? But it doesn't always have to end like that. And there is a break clause in your a break in the evacuation checklist, which says if an evacuation is necessary. So once you've done all the ECAM and you've got to the point now where you need to make a decision based on all the information the commander has, it asks you, is an evacuation necessary? So is it safer outside than inside? So just be mindful of that when we're going through this. So decisions have to be made rapidly, and if communication between the cabin and the cockpit is not clear, as was in these two case studies, of the evacuation is delayed by passengers trying to take all the evacuations is delayed by passengers trying to take their personal belongings, and in one of these instances somebody actually went up the slide again to go and get a mobile phone, would you believe? These have critical consequences to the outcome. And now we look at comms in quite a bit of detail here between crew and passengers. So from the pre-flight briefing until the safe evacuation of all occupants, this article provides recommendations for both flight crew and cabin crew to ensure a safe and efficient emergency evacuation is performed. So case study 1 and case study 2. Remember, note that both evacuations here were initiated by the cabin crew. In this first one, we look at an evacuation during taxi due to the cabin crew detecting smoke. And interestingly with this one, there was no ECAM. So you can imagine, kind of puts you out of sorts a little bit here, doesn't it? You're looking at an emergency evacuation without any ECAM. So that kind of puts you out of sequence a little bit. So, you just kind of have to think outside the box a little. So let's just have a quick run through this, and it looks at an event analysis as well. It's not very long, don't worry, but it's important to watch this to have some context, or to listen to this to have some context. So a 319 was taxiing along the taxiway when the passengers and cabin crew detected smoke in the cabin. So there was enough there for the passengers and cabin crew to detect some smoke, but there was no ECAM at this point. The purser used the interphone to notify the flight crew and asked the captain's permission to evacuate. The captain set the parking brake to stop the aircraft on the taxiway and called ATC to report that they detected smoke in the cabin and that they would initiate an emergency evacuation. So the communication there between the cabin crew and the pilots and ATC is working at this point. So as the smoke became thicker in the cabin, the purser called again to the cockpit, insisting that an evacuation was necessary and requested that the captain urgently initiate the evacuation. The captain turned on the evacuation alarm by pressing the command push button switch on the evac panel on the overhead to initiate the evacuation, but critically did not make the announcement to the cabin using the passenger address PA system such as evacuate, evacuate. Of course, he wasn't going to do that because he's not really ready to do it, but pressing the command button clearly sent a signal. The cabin crew then immediately began the evacuation, but of course both engines were still running. Now, the cabin crew at the rear doors of the aircraft had to hold up the passengers ready to evacuate the aircraft for more than 30 seconds until the engines were shut down. So good hindsight there from the crew. And the flight crew saw the ECAM alerting that the doors were open with the engines running and shut down the engines using the fire push buttons instead of the master switches. So they would have heard a ding, 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 ding as, as the doors were opening. And then had the presence of mind to shut the engines down. So event analysis. Without the presence of any ECAM alerts, with the pressure from the cabin crew, the captain initiated the emergency evacuation. The QRH evac procedure that specifically requested the flight crew to ensure that the engines were shut down before initiating evacuation, of course, was not followed. Because no announcement came, or because no announcement was made in the cabin crew for the evacuation, some passengers mistook the evacuation alarm as a smoke alarm and did not immediately react, causing some delay and confusion to begin the evacuation. Other passengers gathered their personal belongings. This resulted in some minor injuries caused by people pushing past them and climbing over one another in the aisles to reach the exit. So you've got two modes going on. People are panicking, trying to get out, and other people are thinking, it's just a fire alarm, what's going on? It's just a smoke alarm, what's happening? I'm just going to get all my bits and pieces. And there are other people here who just couldn't get out quickly enough. So a lot of confusion there between the evacuation actually being actioned and not being ordered, although kind of a hybrid order with the evac alarm, and then an evacuation without the procedures actually being followed. So you can see how dangerous that is. Now, guys, what I should have said before we're looking at these case studies, we're not evaluating anybody here. We are simply reading, simply learning, seeing what's happened, and so that we can learn from it. Okay, we mustn't make any judgment on the crew here. That's really very important, and I should have said that earlier, as I always do with these things. So case study 2. This is a rejected takeoff, again with the cabin crew initiating the evacuation. The question is, was it immediately life-threatening? And again, you can check your SPM here, the Cabin Procedures Manual, to define what's actually said in there. But the question mark here is, with an RTO, an engine shutdown contained, was there immediate threat of life, or was it immediate life-threatening, I guess? And it expounds on that a little bit later on. But let's have a look at it. So the left engine on A320 suffered a contained failure during the takeoff roll at a ground speed of 31 knots, so low speed RTO. The captain immediately rejected the takeoff and brought the aircraft to a stop on the runway. He announced, attention crew at stations, twice. This puts them on alert and alerts them that the pilots are under control and to expect some further communication from the flight deck. The flight crew completed the ECAM action, shut the engine down, the left engine, and contacted the rescue and firefighting services to make sure there was no visible fire outside of the aircraft. The flight crew decided to taxi the aircraft off the runway and were about to tell the cabin crew to resume normal operations, but the purser had already initiated the emergency evacuation. Taxiing clear, about to call normal operations, and the evacuation was initiated. The purser initiated the emergency evacuation but did not inform the flight crew, despite the attention crew at station announcement, which clearly indicated the flight crew was in control of the situation. And of course, that's the purpose of the call, isn't it? Lack of knowledge of the communication system hindered communication between the crew members. Got to get to the bottom of that. I think even though there was no sign of immediate danger, the purser initiated the emergency evacuation without a decision from the captain, and the right engine was still running. Fortunately, only some of the passengers suffered minor injuries, some of which were caused by them being blown over by the jet exhaust coming out from the right engine that was still running, and many of the passengers gathered their personal belongings and took these with them when they evacuated the aircraft. Again, you know, some confusion there perhaps. Okay, so 2 case studies there, not over evaluated, not too detailed, but you get the message here. There's some common themes coming out here about evacuation being ordered by the cabin crew in those 2 cases, and lack of communication between the flight deck and the cabin, which is really what this is all about. The next thing then goes on to, or the next part of the article talks about be prepared for the evacuation. Okay, so being prepared makes it easier to perform an emergency evacuation and will help the crew in their capacity to make decisions and apply the standard operating procedure in what is or what would be a stressful environment. So keeping up together with your SOPs, all the recurrent training you do in the simulator, and also that the cabin crew help keep those SOPs to hand and those procedures to hand. I won't talk about the crew briefing now because it comes on to that later on. Aircraft knowledge. To ensure efficient evacuation, the cabin crew must have extensive knowledge of the aircraft systems. This includes a cabin communication system, so that's the SIDS for us, and the FAP and its use. And the aircraft configuration, especially the cabin layout, could impact visibility of the cabin and other cabin crew members or generate congested areas. Operating a diverse fleet can imply various cabin configurations that have different numbers of exits or positions of galleys and toilets, etc. And the cabin crew must be familiar with the cabin layout to ensure efficient emergency evacuation. So this is really more about mixed fleet operations. Okay, so I'm going to move on from that. The crew briefing. Maintaining effective communication and ensuring compliance with the standard operating procedures starts with the pre-flight brief. This is when the flight crew and cabin crew should define together any parameters that could affect their decision making if an emergency were to occur. It is also the opportunity to review the emergency evacuation procedure with the associated standard call-outs and discuss them in the context of the upcoming flight. The crew should take into account any specific conditions such as airport equipment. That's the various firefighting services that you're likely to expect at that particular airport, particularly if they're limited or reduced. External conditions such as fog and the application of MEL items. I think that's a really important one, because I wonder how many of us actually discuss something like that in whether or not any MEL items that are being carried might actually have an effect on how you would evacuate the aircraft. I can't think off the top of my head, but it just kind of rang a bell with me about just how important that is. And how often do we talk about emergency evacuations with our cabin crew? Probably not very often, and the cabin crew, certainly in our company, have topics of which they discuss. I can't remember off the top of my head how frequently they change, or it might be the cabin manager can just choose a topic. But perhaps really as pilots, if we haven't discussed this for a while, it might be worth just running through that with cabin crew and reminding of the areas of responsibility and what they would expect to hear from the flight deck and what their next actions are. Maybe if it's just to put it in the back of the mind and bring it slightly forward so that, God, if it did happen, at least there was some conversation or something to bring it to the fore. I don't know. But yeah, I just wonder how many times this is actually brought up in the briefing. At the beginning of the flight, the cabin crew must select able-bodied passengers, ABPs, who are to assist them in the case of the evacuation. They must also identify any passengers who may require additional support during the evacuation. For example, unaccompanied children. Now, we don't have them, but your airline might have a policy where they do carry unaccompanied children. I tell you what's important to make sure, I'm having a coffee, sorry. I tell you why it's important to make sure that you have ABPs, because we're doing our door training now, biannual door training in the simulator when we do our LPCs, etc. And emergency exits is covered both the 321 and 19 and 20. The 19 and 20, of course, having the plug type doors. And they're 30 odd pounds, those things. The 321, no problem, it just flies out. But lifting that out, pulling it in, and then having to sort of rest it on your knees and then just throw it out, that's heavy work. I mean, you've got to be very able to do that, you know, and I'm sitting there demonstrating it to the crew before they do it, and it's a tough job. The reality is, in emergencies that have occurred and the subsequent investigations, a lot of those doors are actually shoved on the floor. We cover that in the Hudson. But they are very, very, very heavy. The pre-flight briefing will help passengers to better prepare for an evacuation if the passengers are encouraged to pay attention. The cabin crew will initiate the location of the nearest emergency exits and should remind passengers to leave all personal belongings inside the exit. They do that anyway, of course, as part of the briefing. But look, how many people read this? I've been on flights recently when I came back from holiday, and I look around me and people have got the AirPods in, earpods, what pods, deaf pods, whatever, and they're just not paying attention, and they're reading newspapers or magazines, or they're just chatting. No one's paying attention. We can't go around and individually tell people to listen, but I think actually as pilots we've got a bit of a responsibility here. Now the cabin crew will do it, but just try and get their attention. Vary your PAs a little bit maybe. Explain to the passengers just how important this is. It literally takes a couple of minutes, and it could be the couple of minutes that saves their lives. I mean, I'm not suggesting that you paint a very grim picture, because half the people will get off because you'll probably terrify them. But just kind of find a way of having the passengers appreciate the gravity of what we're about to do, and that what the cabin crew are showing them might be really useful if anything untoward was to come your way. Okay. We know that every takeoff is a rejected takeoff and potentially an evacuation, but they're not thinking that. Okay, so it's just finding a way of getting the passengers to sort of move away from that. The problem is we're victims of our own success, aren't we? Because we've made flying a bit like catching a bus. Anyway. The silent review it talks about here. So the silent review is a 30-second review. Is recommended for cabin crew to mentally recall the key aspects of emergency evacuation procedure while they are seated at their station before each takeoff and landing, and decreases the risk of distraction. The silent review will help the cabin crew focus and be prepared in case an emergency evacuation is required, and this technique will also help minimize the all-important startle effect. You run through that in your mind, or the cabin crew has, so if it happens, they're already there. Now, I think most crew are very, very good at this, and I've positioned on a number of flights, and I've sat towards the back here, and the crew are very, very good. The magazines go where, you know, there's no talking, and they just spend that time going through it. I have, however, been on long-haul flights before, and I won't mention the airline, where we were all sat down, seatbelt signs went on, everyone clipped in, and the cabin crew were just sitting there just sort of chatting about their night stop. Anyway, I don't know, perhaps they cover those things and I didn't hear it, but anyway, it's really important. But that's a cabin crew thing, which is just a reminder for them to get themselves in the right headspace. Okay, so now we look we move on to some of the sort of top tips and helping with some structure and what all this means, and how we can look at protecting ourselves in making sure, or to do our best to ensure a safe outcome in the event of an evacuation. So this article then looks at stop, inform, ECAM, and assess. And I really like this because this is a really nice structure, and I'm going to use this actually when it comes to briefing the RTO and an evacuation, because it nicely breaks it down. So in the case of an emergency situation, during the takeoff or landing, task sharing should be established and respected so that the crew are well prepared for a potential emergency evacuation. So guys, before going into this, just take time to review your SOP and your evacuation checklist and just walk your way through it. The first time that you pick this checklist up, you don't want it to be in a possible evacuation. All right, so when you got a bit of time and you're a bit bored one night and you're having a beer, just go through it and just think, well, what are your drills and your SOP in the event of an RTO? And when you come to a stop and the parking brake's on, attention crew at stations, you've gone through the ECAM, the captain then says evacuation checklist and makes the call to ATC. You pull out the checklist and you're able to run through that carefully and it's not a surprise to you, if you know what I mean. So yeah, you go through the actions and you know what the checklist is getting you to do and trying to achieve. I'm a big believer in understanding what these things are trying to do. So take your time to go through that. The flight crew must bring the aircraft to a stop and set the parking brake. In the case of a fire, they should consider positioning the aircraft so that the wind direction will blow the flames away from the fuselage. I talk about that when we looked at the RTO and how to achieve that. It's not that easy, but there are best practices. Inform ATC. Once the aircraft has stopped, the flight crew should inform the ATC. So the first officer will probably have already advised ATC during that rejected takeoff. One of his responsibilities is that the aircraft is stopping. Then the aircraft's come to a stop. And then at some point the CM1, in the event of an evacuation and calls the evacuation checklist, will then tell ATC. The captain informing the cabin crew. So you've done the stop, now it comes to the inform. After the aircraft stops, the captain tells the cabin crew to prepare for a possible evacuation. Doesn't use those words critically, okay, that's really important, but uses the term attention crew at stations. This call out is made through the passenger address system, the PA, which lets the cabin crew know that the flight crew is not incapacitated and that they are performing the actions to determine if an evacuation is required. And that's really important. This call out avoids unnecessary evacuations initiated by the cabin crew, or certainly aims to achieve that. Also informs the cabin crew that the pilots are in control of the situation. The first officer then clears the ECAM actions. Okay, so we're now on to ECAM. The first officer should independently perform any ECAM actions and read in the read and do manner. We know that they don't need confirmation if it's engines, masters and fire switches on the ground. It then talks about the A220, which we're not going to move on to. When the ECAM actions are completed, the first officer can then assist the captain with the situation assessment. What do you see? Might be some of the questions that the captain might ask. What is your assessment of the situation? What can you see? This is where the captain has to decide, is it safer outside the aeroplane for yourselves, your crew and the passengers, or at the present time, is it safer in it? Okay, it doesn't always have to be an evacuation at this point. So this is where you have your first bite at the cherry to decide whether or not you're going to initiate an evacuation. The captain should use any possible means to get a clear and comprehensive overview of the situation. Use ATC, stick your head out the window, maybe talk again to the cabin crew and say, look, what can you see? You know, use each other. Anything that you can see outside, all the sources that you have available to you. They can use direct communication with any relevant person, for example, cabin crew, ATC, ground personnel, rescue, firefighting services. The decision to evacuate should rely on the captain's judgment based on their assessment of the overall situation. This is why communication is very important. Cabin crew assess the situation and identify usable exits. This is what the cabin crew are going to be going through now. As soon as the flight crew informs the cabin crew of the possible evacuation by the attention crew at stations, remember, we don't use the word evacuation. The cabin crew must assess a situation at each cabin station. They should identify the available exits and begin to assess the outside conditions as well as the conditions inside the cabin. The cabin crew must communicate any pertinent information to the flight crew. So is the cabin now filling up with smoke, for example? So again, it comes back to this communication and keeping the communication lines going. We've got a solid armoured door between us, but we must make that transparent. The last thing then is decide, secure and initiate. So deciding if an evacuation is required. This is when we think that it's probably safer outside than it is inside. The situation that leads to an emergency evacuation can be very stressful with high workload in a short period of time for both flight crew and cabin crew. The decision to evacuate is irreversible. Once you light the fuse here, okay, there's no going back. Things are going to kick off. Things are going to happen. You're going to start a chain reaction. The main factors that result in the crew initiating the emergency evacuation are such as uncontrollable fire, thick smoke, and severe structural damage. In most cases, the flight crew initiates the evacuation. However, in catastrophic situations with immediate risk of life-threatening injuries, or when the flight crew are incapacitated, the cabin crew can decide to initiate the evacuation. Remember, check your manuals for more information and guidance here. If the evacuation is not required, i.e. the fire is extinguished, the captain should notify the cabin crew and should resume normal operations. That will be the time to let the cabin crew know to sort of stand down, as it were, which is what the crew were about to do in that scenario we looked at. So the call cabin crew normal operations would be the next call. Again, check your SOP. If there's a need for an evacuation, if the situation requires an evacuation, the captain calls for the emergency evacuation procedure to be performed. Now, when I say that once you start this process, it can't be, you can't change it, okay? Once you light the fuse, it's gone. You're just going through the initial actions of an evacuation here, okay, by securing it, all right? But you then have the option at that point to still not command the evacuation. That's a really critical thing to remember here, okay? We're talking here about initiating the emergency evacuation procedure by securing the aircraft, okay? And to make it safe to go out. But there is still another option here before we light that fuse, all right? And that's the thing to remember. So review that checklist. You do have a second bite at the cherry. So the need for evacuation. If a situation requires an evacuation, the captain calls the emergency evacuation procedure to be performed. The emergency evacuation checklist. Secure the aircraft as per the emergency evacuation procedure. So now we're into securing. To ensure safe evacuation, the flight crew must secure the aircraft before the evacuation is initiated by performing the following actions. So just because we're going through this process in securing it, we're doing this before we action the evacuation, and we still have a chance not to evacuate at this point. Check the differential is 0. If the cabin pressure SDP page to prevent explosive door opening due to residual pressure, if the manual pressure mode was used in flight. So you're not going to get this on, well, I can't imagine you'd get this on a departure because you can't depart without 2 CPCs working, okay? But in the event of a landing and having to evacuate, that's different because it might be that you did have CPC 1 and 2 fail and you haven't managed the cabin properly and you still have residual pressure. So you have to take that into account in the event of a landing, not so in an RTO. But that's the purpose. It's basically to have 0 differential pressure for opening the doors. Set all engine masters to off. Press all engine fire and APU fire push buttons purely to secure them. And press the relevant engine and or APU agent push buttons as required in the case of an engine and or APU fire. Remember, you only need to press the extinguishers on the damaged APU or engine, not all of them. Otherwise you give the engineers a nasty mess to clean up unnecessarily. Good, okay. Order from the flight crew. The captain initiates evacuation with a short and clear announcement to the cabin crew over the PA. So once a decision is made to evacuate, that then comes out over the PA. The captain presses the evac command. Now the toggle switch will be in captain, all right? It talks about the A220. This ensures clear communication with the cabin crew and it helps the flight crew to focus on the other actions in the high workload situation. So that starts the evacuation horn, gets the cabin crew started with it, and the command over the PA is evacuate, evacuate, unfasten your seatbelts and get out. Now just a reminder here, the horn off push button silences the cockpit horn when the cabin crew initiate the evacuation. All right, and there's a bit of confusion here about what that button does. So if you initiate the evacuation by pressing the evacuation horn, if you press the horn off button, it's not going to do anything, okay, because you've initiated it, and that is actually going off in the cabin. The only way that works is if they initiate the evacuation and you want to silence a horn on the flight deck, okay? Why I'd want to do that, I don't know, but there is the option. I guess it's for distraction, basically. So the order from the cabin crew can initiate an emergency evacuation only in the case of a catastrophic event or if the flight crew have become incapacitated and normal disembarkation is no longer possible. The cabin crew can use the evac command available on the flight attendant panel. I've got pictures that pop up here and around the screen, or as an option on any additional attendant panel. Okay, that's if your aircraft is fitted with that. They can also use this command to request that the flight crew initiate the evacuation if they are not authorised to do so directly. So that depends on your company standpoint on that. So evacuate, open seatbelts, fasten your seatbelts and get out. Again, you've pressed the horn, and so the crew have decided it's safer outside the airplane. They now initiate the evacuation. This is the bit that we can't go back on. This is why it's really important to make sure that we're doing the right thing. Sorry, I'm just checking my batteries here. This is why it's really important to make sure that we're doing the right thing. When we light this fuse and we say evacuate, you can't say, no, hold on, no, sorry, changed my mind. Made a mistake, everything's okay, the fire light's gone out now, it's happening, the doors are opening, the slides are opening, and people are bailing out. So this is why you've got to be very clear and very sure by using all those resources available to you that the evacuation is, I've said that enough now. An efficient evacuation is quick and safe. An efficient evacuation is quick and safe evacuation. An efficient evacuation is a quick and safe evacuation. The cabin crew have an enormously important task here. Okay, what the cabin crew actions are outside the scope of this briefing. Okay, but we really can't underestimate just how fantastically trained our cabin crew are, and how important their job is in a situation like this. It can't be underestimated. The objective on an emergency evacuation is to evacuate all aircraft occupants as quickly and as safely as possible to ensure they have the best chance of survival in case of a life-threatening situation. Therefore, after the cabin crew identify the usable exits and check that the slides are deployed and inflated, while all this is happening, they'll be trying to keep the passengers back. The objective of them is to maintain an evenly distributed flow of passengers towards the available exits. Okay, I've just had to re-record the back end of this video twice now because we're having problems with the sound, so I'm really hoping I haven't got to do this again. So we finished off there with towards all available exits. Now, passenger behaviour is really interesting. I covered this in a bit of detail in the Hudson video that I did, but interesting about learning and understanding passenger behaviour in an evacuation and where they actually vacate compared to where they boarded the aircraft. And many actually exited the aircraft where they boarded rather than from their immediate, their nearest emergency exit. So crowd control and passenger control there is going to be really important for the cabin crew, and a really tough gig. So throughout the evacuation process, a constant real-time assessment of the situation is necessary in terms of aircraft and external conditions, exit usability and passenger flow. The situation can change rapidly, and the efficient communication between all the crew is essential to share any elements that can impact the evacuation. Presence of immediate danger such as fire or smoke, an exit becoming unusable due to a damaged slide or external conditions, a congested exit or an exit with reduced flow of passengers. As a result, the crew must rapidly make decisions and adapt to changing scenarios in a dynamic and stressful environment. This will ensure a constant flow of passengers to each usable exit and therefore a quick evacuation. So passenger management, multiple and unpredictable behaviours. We look at this a little bit more. We've covered a little bit in case study 1, but I'll talk about more in a second. But under stressful conditions, people can have varied reactions. Unlike cabin crew who are trained, passengers clearly are not. They can have unpredictable reactions that can jeopardise their own safety and that of other aircraft occupants, their fellow passengers. Panic can lead to a frozen passenger overwhelmed by the situation, or passengers trying to evacuate as soon as possible by aggressively pushing past other passengers as referred to in case study 1. But one thing that it doesn't allude to here is when families are separated, so you've got an adult and a child and an adult and a child, usually they try and meet each other before they vacate. So that can cause confusion and restricted flow as well. So risk to slow down the evacuation. Passengers that do not comply with cabin crew instructions can put the success of an evacuation at risk. Baggage retrieval, use of phones, and not jumping on the evacuation slides are the most common factors that slow down an evacuation. Be assertive. Now, this is an interesting dynamic for the crew because they have to sort of be warm and smiley and welcoming, but they also have to be pretty forceful if necessary. And if you watch any video, certification video there's plenty of them available, and how they evacuate passengers with the reduced number of exits available. They have to get them all out in, I think, 90 seconds. They are literally throwing people off. It's quite incredible. So assertive management of passengers is key to dealing with the risks that could impact the success of an evacuation. The cabin crew must use clear and concise orders and use loud voice and assertive body language to ensure that all the passengers follow their instructions. The challenge for the cabin crew is to switch from this nice smiling cabin crew to an assertive one and use physical force if necessary. We then come on to the evacuation of the crew. Each cabin crew member should check for their remaining passengers, and as soon as their assigned area is empty, they would then normally evacuate the aircraft. When the actions are completed in the cockpit, the first officer should assist the cabin crew with evacuation of passengers in the cabin if accessible, and assist the crew on the ground. If they can't access the cabin for whatever reason, then of course, let's say it was thick smoke or something, then obviously you'd vacate through your DV window using the emergency rope, escape rope. The captain, and of course you take the any emergency equipment with you, first aid kit, etc. Also remember the load sheet as well, so that you can reconcile the passenger head count. The captain should be the last crew member to evacuate the cockpit and the last one to evacuate the aircraft. After the final check that all the aircraft occupants have evacuated, that's why you get paid the big bucks. They are in charge of the operations on the ground until the rescue and emergency services then assume responsibility. Keep focused even after the evacuation. So after the evacuation, the crew remain responsible for the passengers until the rescue and emergency services arrive. In 2008, after a successful evacuation, one passenger actually went back inside the aircraft to retrieve their personal belongings. I mentioned earlier on about unpredictable behaviours. So get them away from the airplane, get them downwind so that they don't have any smoke inhalation, but move them away from the airplane to remove that temptation to get back on it, I guess. So to prevent this situation from occurring, the cabin crew should gather the passengers away from the aircraft to prevent any potential danger. They should also count them and provide first aid. So that's where the load sheet comes in handy. For that, they had to take any necessary equipment during the evacuation to help them with crowd management on the ground, megaphones, flashlights, particularly if it's at night, and that sort of thing. Guys, I'm going to close the briefing there because the article then goes on to the importance of realistic training. It's more from the training perspective and the training establishment and how to sort of increase realism. So I don't think we need to go in there. I think we've taken lots of take-home points, or at least I hope you have, from the safety article. So I'm going to close there. I'm going to thank you very much for watching as always. Hopefully you've taken something away from it. Stay safe. Keep the plates spinning. Stay tuned. Lots more coming up, and I'll look forward to seeing you with another brief in the near future. Thanks very much, and bye for now.